Okay, all right, so we'll go ahead and get started. And so what we're going to do today, first of all, I want to talk a bit about the exam, which exam was obviously last week, and I haven't actually gone through to see how many have completed the exam and how many did not. But if you did not, and anybody who's watching this live on Zoom or in class or on the video, on the recorded video, get with me this week, because you'll have this week to do it as a make. Discuss what day you want to take the exam, and it's not a big deal, but I do need to know what day, because it doesn't, I have to manually go in and do that. So just let me know if that's your situation. Obviously we drop the lowest of the first four exams, the scores. So you've always got the option of, if you feel like you didn't do well, or simply choose not to take an exam, which I don't really advise, but it's, you're free to do what you like. But then that will, whatever your lowest scores will simply just go away at the time when the grades are prepared, the final grades are prepared. So know that you've got that going on there. Okay. So, go ahead.
Like, if we go back to the test, do they tell us which ones we got wrong?
Yeah. So what's going to happen is, so I'll make it available in Brightspace for you, but it's going to be after this week is over. So, and I know that there's always a sort of a push-pull here between quick availability and the flexibility of allowing for makeups. So you'll get the availability, but it'll be next week. And unless everyone's taken it, if everyone's taken it, then I'll simply make it available in Brightspace. You just simply go in and you'll see a link for it. You can click on it. You can see all the answers, all the questions, all the answers. What you missed, I think it actually shows. I don't have the same view as you do, so I can't say exactly what it looks like from your view, because I don't have your view, but it'll, as I understand it, it'll show what you got wrong, what you got right, and what the correct answers are. So there's a week. So, there's always, it'd be nice for everybody to be able to see immediately how well you did. And I know in a regular person-to-person face-to-face class, we usually go over them pretty soon after the exam's over. But given the fact that I think, given, our students are busy, it's a community college, people have jobs and families and whatnot, that sometimes people do makeups, and I want to make that flexibility available, but you will be able to see it, so it'll be there. And if anybody has any questions, after you take a look at that, once it's available, just get with me and I can go over any of those questions. Okay? And also, as every exam, as we come up on every exam, as I mentioned before, I usually try to take about a half an hour or 40 minutes or whatever to review for the exam, to go over some of the things that you should expect to focus on for the exam. And it's usually, I think, relatively close to what you'll see on the exam. That's always my goal. Okay. All right. So questions for me? Anybody here or anybody on the Zoom? I think we've only got one person on the Zoom link. So any other questions? I passed around the sign-in sheet. That's moving its way around. So what we're going to do is this. I want to take a real brief look here. As I was preparing over the weekend for the class, you'll notice if you go into the course site, you go into coursework and syllabus, that I had planned initially for this week, this is week 4, obviously today's the 30th, week 4, to discuss chapters 4 and 5. And as I was looking this over, I think I'm not going to cover chapter 4, I think. I had covered it before in class, I've covered it, sometimes I've covered it, sometimes I've not. And I think I'm going to skip chapter 4, because the main stuff I want to cover on chapter 4 is going to be covered primarily in some of the content from chapter 3, which I didn't quite finish last time, and so we did an exam over it. That was consumer surplus, producer surplus, price controls. So I'm going to cover some of that. One of the price control issues is covered in chapter 4 that deals with the minimum wage. The minimum wage is a form of price control. So it's a wage control, but it's a price control. And so we're going to cover that. And then also some of the other content is I covered, I believe it's in chapter 16 or 19, I forget, one of these, I forget, but I think the main event from that is going to be covered there. So we're not going to cover chapter 4. So if you're following along, you can just sort of scratch that off of your syllabus. And in fact, on this week's module, I put here under the, it comes up here, let me see here. There it is, weekly checklist. Read chapter 5 new, but still, we're going to go straight to chapter 5.
So chapter 4 is not going to be on any test.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And chapter 4 is kind of a strange chapter. I don't. It's kind of a chapter. I don't know that I would if I were writing the text, I would put both of those two topics together. It's labor and financial markets. And I don't know that I quite get that and appreciate that. And so I guess in that respect, I'm maybe a little bit critical. I know sometimes instructors are maybe advised not to be critical of the text, but I think those are two things that really don't go very well together, particularly in a micro section, because financial markets are really not something we cover very much in micro. We do cover them somewhat in macro. Oh, and I forget, this is where I don't have the remote, so I've got to swivel the camera here. I forgot about that. So somebody made off with the remote in this class. I don't know who did that, but anyway, so we're ready to go here. And it was a little bit slower, but it's fine. I think we should be okay. So, okay, so what we're going to do is this. I had mentioned to the class before we reviewed for the first exam that we weren't getting all through chapter 3 just because we really didn't have time. We may have had time if we hadn't had the holiday on the 16th, but given that, you know, we try to work around it, and I do like to keep the exam schedules on pace because I just think it's good. Particularly, we have a busy student body, you know, jobs and military deployments and all kinds of things. It'd be nice to put on your schedule, any kind of a master schedule, where you're going to be and what you're going to be doing. So, you know, if I drop some material off, it's really to your benefit, not to your disadvantage generally. So what was covered in the rest of chapter 3 is, and some of these are in, I've actually duplicated the first, I guess, 4 or 5 slides for this week. It's also covered in last week's module. I just didn't get to it, so I just dropped it, but I didn't want to take away the original PowerPoints. But this deals with the rest of chapter 3, and that is the idea of supply and demand as they come together, and what can we expect in terms of benefit to the supply side, benefit to the demand side. So I'm going to cover a couple topics. First, this is something called consumer surplus, and that is the value accruing. This is sort of the textbook definition. The value accruing to buyers of goods, and again, the term goods we're going to use as sort of the euphemism for goods and services, who are willing and able to pay a price which is greater than the equilibrium price. Okay, so let's take a look at what that might look like. And obviously, your text has got some discussion of that, but let's go over it here so that we are a little bit better attuned to what's going on here. So I'm going to sort of bring up some of the lights here in order to make this a little bit more easily seen. So all I'm going to do is this. I'm going to simply reconstruct here a PQ plane, right? So price on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis. So we've got a downward sloping demand curve, okay, looking something like that, and an upward sloping supply curve, okay? And so this is sort of where we kind of left off last time, was saying, okay, well, demand is downward sloping. In other words, there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded, and with supply, it's just the opposite. There's a direct relationship between price and quantity supply. That is, as one thing goes up, the other thing goes up. It's just the opposite. As one thing goes up, the other thing goes down when it comes to demand. And quantity are all these infinite number of points along the horizontal or the quantity axis, okay? And again, one of the things that I talked about in class was to try to be careful about supply and confusing supply with quantity, because that's a very common misconception, and unfortunately too many people do it, but it's easy to see why. And I think that probably even a lot of people who deal with these things on a routine basis probably make the same mistake very often. So, but we'll talk more about that. So where we really, about as far as we got in chapter 3 was this. We said that, okay, when price and quantity, or when demand and supply come together, we have an equilibrium point right here. And that equilibrium point, remember, it's just a point on this plane, so it's got an ordered pair. In other words, it's got a vertical coordinate, it's got a horizontal coordinate, and we simply refer to those as equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And with equilibrium quantity, we simply said it's a point at which quantity demand, excuse me, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. In other words, there is no surplus and no shortage. And I'm going to get into a more and surpluses a bit later. I did get into the fact a little bit of the idea that the price is here for whatever reason, then it's you end up with where the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, and that's a surplus. If the price is down here, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, and so as a result, we have a shortage. And I'll get into a bit more of this in a bit later. But for the most part, we say that markets will tend toward either being in equilibrium or moving toward equilibrium. And one of the things that I think is important to reiterate, because I know sometimes it seems like this is overly theoretical and even maybe a little bit abstract. And that's the idea. How do we know equilibrium really exists? Is that just sort of a concoction that economists are trying to push on society, or is it a real thing? And I will say that it's mostly a real thing, because I think for the most part, most markets, at least in the short run, remember, we're taking a picture of this market. It will change. So as a result, we'll take a new picture once things move, once supply shifts, demand shifts, maybe they both shift and whatnot. But for the most part, we see fairly stable prices, pretty stable quantities. Over time, prices tend to go up as we have an inflating economy, but that's more of a subject for macro. But for the most part, in the very short run, we can just take a picture and say it's mostly stable. Also, so prices that's one manifestation of equilibrium is price. The other is quantity. And that is I think I mentioned this sort of example in class. It's not often the case that we've just got a huge surplus of goods where nobody can sell anything because there's just no demand for it at that particular price. And as a result, warehouses are overflowing and trucks aren't moving because there's nobody wanting to buy. It doesn't really happen too often. And there aren't really shortages where there's just a huge wipeout of goods and just nothing is available. And I know that during the COVID pandemic, we were exposed to some shortages, mostly because of supply issues. And I think in some ways, maybe the only good thing, I don't know if there were any other good things that came out of the pandemic, but maybe the only good thing was it sort of pointed out to people the idea that there could be differences between quantity supplied and quantity demanded and shortages. And we certainly, for any of us who lived through that, which I presume is all of us, we all saw some shortages, okay? All right, so this is essentially where we got to with regard to chapter 3. Here's the question, okay? So think about what the demand curve is, and we're going to focus on consumer surplus first, and that is the economics of the buyer, okay? And the term consumer surplus is a little bit misleading because it suggests that all demand is done by consumer or household buyers. And in fact, when we talk about demand, in general, it could be business to business transactions where it's firms buying stuff from other firms. It could be government buying things from firms. It could be the labor market. We're going to get to this. I sort of deferred this conversation about the labor market until a bit later in the course because I think it fits a little bit better later. And it doesn't really go with the financial market discussion. But that's an output as well. We as households provide our labor, and so it becomes an output, and there's demand for it. If there weren't demand for it, nobody would pay for it. So as a result, we're focusing on demand we're focusing on the demand side of the market when we talk about consumer surplus. But think about this. Nobody's outlawed the law of demand. The law of demand essentially says that there's a relationship between price and quantities demanded, but there are people who higher prices for these goods for whatever reason. And right now, we don't really care what reason there is. But let's say the equilibrium price of, I don't know, shoes is $40, right? And I know there are all kinds of different kinds of shoes out there, and maybe 40 is not the right price, but just an example, so kind of bear with me. But maybe for this particular kind of shoe, maybe somebody's willing to pay 60, and maybe somebody's willing to pay 5. All of these prices are examples of people who are willing and able to pay a price that is greater than the equilibrium price. Remember, the equilibrium price is the market clearing price, where there is no shortage and no surplus. At these prices, people are willing to pay more, but they don't have to because there's an equilibrium price. And think about this. This is one of the benefits to consumers that is often not understood by a lot of people. And that is, let's say if you go to Walgreens, you want to buy a 12-pack of Coke, and you expect to pay $6 or whatever. That's probably low. Let's say you expect to pay $8, and you get there and it's on sale for $6. Well, you don't go to the cashier and say, you know what, I came here expecting to pay $8. By all rights, I owe you $8 because that's what it's worth to me. Nobody does that, right? That's kind of a ridiculous behavior. Instead, we do what? We pay the $6 and click our heels and count our lucky stars because we were willing to pay a higher price, but don't have to because the equilibrium price is lower. Now, if you want to pay a price lower than the equilibrium price, that's sort of you're out of luck. And I've talked about this idea that in our society, in our economy generally, we don't really have a lot of bargaining capability as buyers, particularly as ordinary consumers. Businesses are a little bit more adept at negotiating because that's sort of, I think they've got more muscle memory and they do that more frequently than what we do as ordinary consumers. But I've talked about this ridiculous scenario where if you walk into a store and start to negotiate over the price of candy bars and Pop-Tarts and hair dryers, it's just not going to go well, is it? I mean, they're just not going to negotiate with you over price. They'll probably ask you to leave. maybe not so nicely ask you to leave. And, who knows what may end up happening. I mean, I think sometimes, and that's unfortunate because I think it'd be nice if we could do that, but it doesn't really happen. I mean, I think we've all been in a situation where we've gone to McDonald's or Burger King and you get behind somebody in line who's asking questions and just questions. It's like, who does not know what a Big Mac is? It's like, oh my God, questions. It's like, we kind of want speed and all that. And it's like, my dad would have been one of those people who ask questions. It's like, just order a Big Mac or don't, it's either do it or don't, So we don't really have this case where we talk about features and price and all that. So, but if we think we're going to pay a higher price, but we don't, all this area here, this entire shaded region is what we call consumer surplus, okay? All that region is called consumer surplus. And if we were to, there's a reason also why I sort of depict these demand and supply curves, at least early on, as being sort of linear, because it sort of makes the math easier. And if you wanted to get into the math of this, which I don't, but there are some econ courses that do, and those of you may take macro at some point and run into this. Well, think about what this is. This is essentially a right triangle, isn't it? That is a right triangle. And what is the area of this region? If it's linear, it's totally a right triangle. The area is 1/2 the base times the height, right? And I'm bringing back memories from high school, right? 1/2 base times height. If this is the base or this is the height, and by the way, it doesn't really make any difference. B times H is the same as H times B. It doesn't make any difference. But 1/2 of that, and why is that? And the answer as to where that calculation even comes from is this. It goes back to this very nature of length times width. And if you have a right triangle, all you're doing is simply bisecting that, right? You end up with, if you're taking a rectangle and bisecting, you've simply got two right angles or two right triangles. So if area here is, let's just rename these height and base. It doesn't really matter if it's base times height. And by cutting it in half, it's 1/2 base times height, which brings us back here. That's all that's really going on. And again, you're not going to have to do any calculations. I just kind of want to show you this because why? This is what's going on. Well, first of all, I will just admit to you all that as a young econ student a long time ago, I struggled with the idea of consumer surplus. I thought it was just mostly theoretical. I didn't really think it was something real at all. But it is. It actually is. In fact, now where does this come up? Is this got real life applications? And the answer is yes, it does. Particularly when you're involving government entities that trying to regulate markets, particularly those markets that are thought to be usurping consumer surplus, I guess is maybe the word. By the way, we've got an example that's going on right now. Google is under a pretty good assault from the government right now, aren't they? Where Google is, I mean, we had many senators last week, I believe it was, saying, hey, Google's a monopoly, and therefore we should do something about Google because they control all this advertising online. They control a lot of the mechanics of how people get to websites and all that. And as a result, they're directing traffic to places they want it to go. They probably have a very good point. And we are going to talk a lot more in the class later about antitrust, which is this sort of general legal area, this, I guess, area of the law, really, and as it deals with economics. It's sort of the intersection between microeconomics and law. And we're going to talk about this. And one of the ways that is examined is consumer surplus being taken out? That is, can a supplier keep raising the price until this gets smaller and smaller and smaller? And one area that's very classic in this, even apart from antitrust regulation of breaking up monopolies and whatnot, is on an everyday basis that of utility regulation, particularly electricity. Electricity tends to be fairly well regulated, much more than natural gas markets for like gas companies, much more than water companies, where, remember, in most places in New Mexico is one of those, if you're a utility providing electricity, you've got to go to a state entity, in this case, it's our Public Regulation Commission, and ask for a rate increase. They call it rate increase. It's really a price increase. And you've got to explain why. And then there's a study done as to what the effect is going to be on the consumer. Is consumer surplus going to be taken away? Is it justified? And yada, yada. And PNM, our local utility, obviously we all know about, is not shy at all about going and asking for rate increases. They do that quite frequently. And for whatever, they call them rates because they're tied to kilowatt hours, I believe, and I'm not, the engineering is not something I've been particularly focused on, but you get the idea that they have to go get those approvals. And one of the things that's looked at is what the effect on consumer surplus is going to be. Now, much more on that a bit later. We will cover that in more detail as we get to the area of regulation, particularly the idea of breaking up monopolies. By the way, P&M is effectively a monopoly, isn't it? I mean, you don't have any other choices for electricity. I mean, what are you going to do, right? I guess run a generator in your backyard. I guess that's maybe, I don't even know if that's a viable option or even a cost-effective option. So as a result, we allow certain firms to have monopolies, but we regulate them so as to not take away too much consumer surplus. Because what's to stop these firms from raising the price, raising the price, raising the price? Not much. And in fact, the evidence is that firms will do that. And in fact, some of the inflationary conditions that we've got sort of macroeconomically, that is through the economy, a lot of people are sort of saying, look, it's firms trying to get away with price increases because they think they can, and they probably are right. They probably are right. I mean, if you look at just certain goods and you're wondering, my gosh, the price of this is going up. I don't do a lot of shopping for my household, but I do some. And I know, like, I would buy Powerade from Walmart. It'd be like 89 cents for a bottle of Powerade. And now I think it's like $1.19. Well, that's a pretty good percentage increase. That's greater than the rate of inflation. So you've got to say, okay, just that one good. I know it's a very limited example. Are they trying to pull off a price increase greater than their own costs, Walmart, whoever is involved in that entire supply chain? Because, I mean, what does that translate to? About 30%, 35% increase in price? Did they really incur that much in order to bring Powerade to the market? I'm skeptical, and so are a lot of other people, because I think some of this inflation is firms being able to pull it off, and the buyers just simply feeling like they have no choice but to accept it. So that'll be an interesting thing that macroeconomists are going to be looking into, because the inflationary phenomenon, frankly, is only about a year and a half underway. We'll be looking at that. But there's no question that if prices go up, it does take away from consumer surplus. So anyway, back to this slide here, though. What is the general rule here? And I think I sort of alluded to it, and that is, or the general principle, and that is that if, oops, I'm gonna get my bearings here. If the price goes up, consumer surplus tends to fall. This makes sense, doesn't it? If the price of a good goes up, excuse me, consumer surplus tends to fall. And when we say consumer surplus falls, we're saying that that area, that shaded region falls. And if the price falls, consumer surplus tends to rise. And one other thing I should probably tell you here is this, that when we talk about measuring surpluses here, let's talk about what it is we're getting at, okay? So I've said, and without getting too deeply into the math, I sometimes think it is nonetheless helpful to kind of see what we're talking about here. So if in fact, let's just say that we're saying, okay, let's forget all this here and just change the numbers around. If area here of that right triangle is 1/2 base times height, and let's say the price of a good, what was it? Was it 40? Was that what it was? Let's say there's an 80 intercept up here, okay? So the difference between this and this is 40. So 1/2, and that's the base, and that's 40 times the height, which whatever this is, I don't think we defined it. Let's say it's 100, just to keep the math simple, times 100. Well, let's do the math here. And it's 20 times 100, basically is 2,000. 2,000 what? $2,000. Why is this expressed as a dollar figure? Because think about this, and this is going to be something that you'll want to lock away, because we're going to be dealing with it. This is a price axis where all the values are denominated in terms of dollars, okay? So this has got a dollar figure, and here's what you want to lock away and hit save in your mind, and that is whenever you have a dollar figure multiplied or divided by a number, which is what this is, these are expressed in numbers, the resulting effect is going to be a dollar figure. It's going to always be a dollar figure. And so when we talk about consumer surplus, we are talking about an actual dollar figure that accrues as value to those who are willing and able to pay more. Now, and again, and I think one of the reasons why I personally struggle with this, just to kind of give you, if my own experience is any benefit, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but just real quickly, is the idea that first of all, we'd have to be able to estimate demand. And I think that's really where the trick is. Do we know what the demand curve looks like for any particular good? And the answer is more or less yes, which is not to say that there are economists involved in very, very tiny markets computing the demand curve or estimating the demand curve. It probably doesn't really exist in a very small market. I can't imagine there's too many people studying the price of snow cones at minor league baseball parks. I mean, maybe somewhere, I don't know. There aren't that many economists in the world, so I don't know if that's going to be an area of focus. But are there economists studying utility regulation? Absolutely. And studying the prices of things like Google and what Google charges, which to the consumer is invisible, but the idea is that we end up paying a higher price if they direct us to websites where we are going to end up paying more for things like car insurance and all that. And increasingly, commerce is moving to the online environment. So I think it's interesting. I'm really getting very interested in that whole thing and seeing what the Justice Department does, because that's our prosecutorial arm of the government, and what happens with that whole thing. I think it's going to be very interesting. So again, remember this: if a dollar figure is multiplied or divided by a number, the resulting effect is going to be a dollar. The dollar figure sort of trumps, it's sort of the Trump value there. Okay. All right. Questions about consumer surplus and what that's all about? Okay. Let me do this. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to get my bearings here with because I've got sort of a monitor on this. I don't have the remote. Not that I was all that good at handling the remote either, but okay, what about the next topic here, which is producer surplus? Okay, well, it's producer surplus. What is that? What's going on there? Well, it's a very similar definition, only it's opposite because the supply curve goes opposite. So here we're talking about suppliers, okay? Suppliers of goods, and again, the term goods is a euphemism for goods and services. We're saying that there's an area where there's value occurring to these sellers who are willing to be able to sell at a price less than the equilibrium price, And so, but they don't have to, because as a result of an equilibrium price, which is market determined, they don't have to do that. So, and again, the same issue arises here, only it's opposite. If the price goes up, producer surplus also rises. If price falls, producer surplus also falls. And what does that sound a little bit like? It sort of mirrors this whole conversation about the supply curve, doesn't it? In fact, it's very relevant that the supply curve is discussed here, because what is the supply curve telling us? That there's a direct or positive relationship between price and quantity. Okay. So what does this look like? All right. So let's say we've got an upward sloping supply curve looking like that, and a downward sloping supply curve looking something like that, right? Equilibrium price, and we'll just stick with the same $40. I guess that's worked for us, and that's an equilibrium price. So put a little asterisk, and it's $40 what? $40, right? Remember, the price axis is a dollar axis. In fact, as we get going throughout the class, so we'll be doing some overlays of both prices of goods and the cost of those goods, and which are two different things. And that's something I'm going to sort of elaborate a bit more on. And I think I mentioned this just a little bit before in class, but one of the things that we've taught, and I'm going to move the camera over here, but is this idea of, wrong way, sorry about that, is this idea that there's a difference between price and cost. And I know that, and I think I've mentioned before that, I know that in everyday speech, we sort of use these terms interchangeably, like, what did that car cost you, or what do those movie tickets cost at this theater, or whatever. And in reality, an economist would say, what is the price of movie tickets? Not the cost. The cost is whatever it costs the theater to bring those tickets to you. I have no idea what it costs to bring a ticket to you, but we're going to actually we're going to get into this example of movies a bit later, because the things about movies is they can charge different prices all over the place, depending upon the different time of day. And why would they do that? Different kinds of buyers, right? Who goes to movies in the afternoon typically? People with kids oftentimes, right? And so if you've got 3 children, and believe me, if you've got children as I do, then it's expensive to take a lot of people, right? So you're probably not going to pay $10, $50, or $11 or whatever it is to go at 8 p.m. So you're going to go earlier in the day, and in order to get you there in the first place, to get you to sit down, they're going to want to offer you a lower price just so you can bring your whole family. And I'm not saying people don't take their kids at 8 o'clock, but I think it's less. I mean, and believe me, I have been to play. My wife and I go at 8 o'clock. If I'm taking my kid, we go at 4 o'clock, something like that. So you're going to get the idea. Different, and we're going to get to this idea of different prices and that whole bit a bit later. Okay, so there's a reason why they charge different prices, and we'll get to that. So what about this idea of producer surplus? Okay, so we're saying that, okay, the price of this good as distinct from the cost, which is the cost of bringing it to market, is $40. But what if I'm a seller and I'm willing to sell that good for 20, or I'm willing to sell for 25? If I'm willing to take 20, I'll take 25 for sure. If I'm willing to take 25, I'll definitely take 30. And if I'm willing to take 30, I'll definitely take 35, and we'll definitely take 40. And that's the price that we're taking, because that's the price that's market determined in a market in which there's a relative amount of visibility. And again, if these are drawn linearly, then we end up with the right triangle here, and we can take the same values. Said equilibrium quantity was 100. And so we can arrive at an equilibrium quantity here of 100. And the same sort of area goes on. So here it's 1/2 base times height. And so it's 1/2. The base is 40 minus, again, it doesn't really matter what's the base, what's the height, because they're interchangeable. 40 minus 20 is 20, right? Times 100. And so here we have $1,000 what? $1,000. Okay. And maybe this isn't quite drawn to scale in relation to the other graph, but it doesn't really make any difference. The thing that we need to know is this entire shaded region here is what we call producer surplus. And why is producer surplus important, and why, and who does it really impact? I don't know that buyers really care about producer surplus. I can tell you that ordinary consumers probably don't care. I think we could absolutely care less what the producer, if we even are aware of it, I don't think we really care. I don't even think business buyers care that much about what the producer surplus is. If they can buy goods at a lower price than the equilibrium price, they'll do so, right? And if somebody has to sell at a lower price, they'll certainly take it. But nonetheless, there's an equilibrium price that settles in, and so as a result, this area is a shaded region. And why might it be important to the supply side of any market? It's because firms that are looking to maybe get into a market are going to see what is the surplus, what is the potential, and if we get into this market, how much, first of all, how much producer surplus is being earned right now? And if in fact a would-be supplier is contemplating entering a market, they're looking at, hey, are people earning a lot, or I shouldn't say people, are firms, suppliers, are they earning an outsized producer surplus? If they are, then what's your motivation if you're a would-be supplier? I want some of that, right? So I want to get into that market and I want to take some of that producer surplus away from them, even if it means I take a lower price. And that's not uncommon at all. Keep in mind what might that look like? It might mean a shift in specter back this direction. And so, in other words, shift, we'll call it S prime. Consumer producer surplus was this region, now it's this region. But somebody might do that in order to, I went the wrong way here. But you might find that, well, actually, no, that is right, because it would shift, it would cut the supply curve in half. That is, if there's only one firm, now there's two firms, A and B, together. And so as a result, now everyone earns less producer surplus. That's very common. And we're going to get into this issue of entry into markets where firms come in and they end up splitting the supply. And as a result, everyone's earning less. But we see that happening. We see this happening all the time, right? So that's producer surplus. And so if the price goes up, producer surplus rises. If price falls, producer surplus also falls. And so that's really the relevance as we're going to use it. And this is not something that is just kind of a one-off discussion from chapter 3. It's not, I'm not getting into this just to sort of tie up loose ends. These are topics that are going to come up again and again, particularly as we get into what is really sort of the heart of this course. And the heart of this course really deals with what we call market structure. And that's the supply side of markets, okay? And we're certainly going to talk about demand side as well, but how do we assess supply sides of markets, okay? And one of the ways that we do this is by focusing on a particular area that are considered out of equilibrium conditions, okay? And this is really the last topic we'll get into in chapter 3. And again, we're skipping chapter 4, we're going to jump into chapter 5. But these are some things that we did not get to just because in the interest of time. So we'll talk about price controls. Now, the two examples I gave you here with regard to consumer surplus and producer surplus were examples of what we call markets in equilibrium. That is, if you were able to take a picture of it, you'd see a relatively stable price in the short run, and a relatively stable quantity in the short run. And then the question arises, how do you define the short run and how do you define the long run? There must be some sort of definition. And I'll give you an answer you're probably not going to like, and I would say it's an economist answer. It really depends. But believe me, we will get to this. I'll give you a little bit more concrete answer a little bit later. I know it's not a very good answer, but I do think it's important to sort of address the fact that there is a difference between the short run and the long run. For right now, let's just be content with the idea that the short run is some period of time less than the long run, as unsatisfactory of an explanation as that is. We will give a much more concrete example, but we got to get into things like costs of production. We're not quite there yet. Okay, so those are equilibrium conditions. Those are conditions which we can take a picture and say, okay, that's what they are. What about a market that's out of equilibrium, where there's a shortage or surplus and it just can't get itself back to equilibrium? And because one of the assumptions of economics, and it goes way, way back to the very beginning of times when people first started thinking about markets, was the idea that markets tend to be in equilibrium or are moving toward them. They can get knocked out of equilibrium for some reason. And I come back to this idea of the pandemic, okay? There's a short run condition. Didn't we all see short run shortages? That's a little bit hard to say. Short run shortages in things like Clorox bleach and paper products at stores like Walmart and Albertsons. But it went away, right? It was out of equilibrium for a time because we couldn't get certain goods. So as a result, the market was out of equilibrium, but it got back into equilibrium. So nobody's talking at all now about shortages of things at stores that I know of. Now, there are shortages in the supply chain for producers, and we're hearing about things like computer chips and high-tech goods that come from other parts of the world where they're still dealing in very serious ways with the pandemic, which is why the president decided that we're going to start to make more of that stuff here. We as Americans are going to make more of that here in order to deal with that, to get out of this condition where markets get knocked out of equilibrium. Now, when we say these get knocked out of equilibrium, sometimes it can happen just because of forces that are unknown. We call them exogenous variables. All exogenous variables is something from the outside that's not modeled within a market. It has nothing to do with demand or supply. It has something to do with something else. Wars, pandemics, in very small markets, things like droughts and floods. And if you're talking about agricultural markets, things like diseases that wipe out crops and wipe out livestock. Those are not things that we model as supply and demand, but we need to take it into account because it's going to affect supply and demand. So those are what we call exogenous. However, what about sometimes when government does these kinds of things and they impose their own judgments as to what the correct price is? So we say price controls are quote unquote normative judgments by government as to the correct price of a good in a market. And remember, I want to sort of circle back to, I think, probably day one of the class, where we talked about two kinds of statements that economists will sort of pronounce. And that is, one is a positive economic statement that means what? It's a statement of what is, it's a factual statement, it's measurable, it's observable, and in and of itself, it's probably not controversial. And then normative statements, which are much more controversial, much more subjective. People are going to disagree over normative judgments. It could be something like, well, I think the example I might have used was President Obama said that everyone should have health insurance. Now, not everyone agreed that we all should, and not only did he say we should have it or else pay a penalty for it, right? And not everyone agreed with that. Well, that's welcome to political and economic life, right? People don't always agree with that. Well, and the same goes with price controls. That is, not everyone agrees with what government's judgment of a correct price will be. And I want to say one thing about price ceilings and price floors. I'm going to get into these a little bit more in depth. Is that I want to make clear that government these are good intentions that government has. I don't want to at all suggest that anybody's up to is up to something that's trying to pull one over on people, or I guess even more cynically, that there is some sort of political favoritism going on, where one side of a market is being rewarded. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen or has never ever happened, because I'm sure it does, I'm sure it has, but these are simply efforts to sort of protect one side of the market or the other. And in one case, it's protection for the demand side. The other case, it's protection for the supply side. And both are going to be judged by economists. And it's almost universally accepted by economists that both of these cause unintentional consequences or unintended consequences. So again, good intentions and all that, and how we're paving the way for good intentions to have ill effects. So the first is price ceilings, okay? This is where the government mandates a price below the market price. Market price, equilibrium price, same thing, okay? P star, whenever you see a value in economics, there's a little asterisk that we usually pronounce as something star. We say that's an equilibrium condition. That is, it's a condition of short-term stability that we can take a picture of. But if the price is mandated, this is where the government says thou shalt only charge a price here, not up here. And the intent is to provide protection for the demand side. And typically results in a shortage of the good. And some examples are price caps on food, fuel, and rents. And rent control, there's probably no other, well, not probably, I'm sure there's no other area that's been more researched when it comes to price controls in general, than rent control. Rent control of housing has been studied and studied and studied. And almost universally among economists, and economists of left, right, and center political persuasion, who say that price controls really result in some real distortion of markets, unintended consequences. And oftentimes, the very people who the protection is offered do not benefit. In fact, they actually end up losing. But again, these are well-intentioned. And by the way, some of these are going away. A lot of these price ceilings and price floors throughout the world are sort of falling by the wayside. Mostly because I think political leaders are starting to understand that really we have unintentional consequences that come about as a result. But they still exist. And by the way, we still hear about cases in which people demand, let's say, a price ceiling. We need help on this. Now, by the way, we've heard a lot about fuel in the last couple of years, haven't we? Gasoline prices have been high. We've had people say, oh, gasoline's too high. The government should do something, right? So rather than paying, let's say gas goes up to $4 a gallon again, which by the way is expected to do by April, where analysts are expecting gasoline to go back up again. Yeah, a little bit of reprieve, but that market is very unstable. Equilibrium goes up, goes down, and whatnot. So we're going to hear more people saying government should do something, put a cap on it. $3 is plenty, and oil companies are making enough money, yada yada. And so as a result, there should be a cap on the price of fuel. Well, there's a problem with that, and there's a problem with all of these when government steps in to provide quote unquote protection for the demand side. And we're going to get to that. The other example is just the opposite condition. Price floors are government mandated price where the price has to be above the market price where it's propped up. Now, one thing I want to say here, because this looks like we've got these terms reversed, but we haven't. We think about ceilings, don't think of the ceiling being up there, think about ceiling being down here. In other words, it could be any, so if the price is here and the mandated price is here, well, that's below it. It could be anything below it, it just can't pop up above that ceiling, right? It definitely can't go up to here, but it can stay here or below. That's the ceiling. So don't think about a ceiling being up there, being down here, and a floor. Think about a floor being there, but being up there. That the market price would be here, but the government says, nope, we're going to put the price here because we're going to provide protection for suppliers. And here, the overwhelming example is agricultural price supports, which still exist, and they're sort of going away in the US, but there are parts of the world in which this is still in effect. Japan is probably one classic example of a price support on rice production. Rice is a very low value output, very low value. It's very inexpensive to produce, it's very expensive as a price, but it's got lots of importance to Japan as a cultural and an economic fact where a lot of people, there are generations of rice farmers. And one thing, I come from a farm family, I can tell you that farmers worldwide are very politically active. And they always want higher prices. Who doesn't want a higher price? If you're selling something, you want a higher price. And so as a result, they have outsized political influence. And so the Japanese have been propping up the price of rice at a very low value output for a very long time. That's an example. But we've done the same here in the US. And I can tell you that my grandfather, who was a longtime farmer and a rancher, really loved President Truman. I know it's been a while, but because Harry Truman was a farmer himself and he had very high prices for food products. And he, of course, is a farmer like that. Who didn't like that was everybody who had to buy food. So again, some people win, people lose when these kinds of things happen. So price ceilings and price floors. Let's talk about what these look like, okay? And so I just want to give you a bit of an example here as to what these are. And then I want to talk specifically about rent ceilings, because this is, as I mentioned earlier, this is probably the classic example of a market in which there have been lots of good intentions about housing prices, but has really resulted in some distortions in the market. So let me, this is a one person shop here. So bear with me. I'm going to swivel the camera back over. For those of you watching on the other direction. So what about a price ceiling? What does it look like? And I know there's lots of discussion in your book, but I think it's important for us to sort of go over this and talk about what this might look like. So, okay, let's see. Okay, so what does a price ceiling look like? Okay, and we'll take the case of housing because it's one of the big ones, particularly rental housing, where we got price as a dollar axis here, you got quantity here, which is a number axis. You've got the idea, you've got a downward sloping demand curve, nothing different here really. There's downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, right? Like that. And we've got some equilibrium price. And let's say it is, I don't know, maybe it's $20 a square foot. I don't even know if that's the right price for I mean, I don't even think about rents in terms of square footage, but I think that's oftentimes how this is adjusted, or sometimes it's by units. And again, rent controlled housing has been all over the board in terms of how it's been administered for a very long time. The idea is that maybe $20, which might translate on a $1,000 per square foot, that's $2,000 per month, right? A lot of people would say that price is too high. It's too high. We can't afford that price. The price should be something lower. And so as a result, government will sometimes step in and mandate a price. We'll call that P bar. And we'll say the price should be 15. So as a result, what happens is we've got a price set lower than the equilibrium price. And the reason why, and they're done for good intentions. That is, as rents go up and people's incomes don't catch up with rents, what happens? They find themselves being priced out. Having to pay higher rents, more people's budgets are going toward rent. And as a result, what happens is they get squeezed out. They either have to come up with it somehow or they have to move. And by the way, we've got something of a local example. It's not quite the same in Santa Fe County, where what has gone on with houses, particularly single family houses, has just gone up and up and up over years now. It's probably reversed a little bit since the pandemic set in, and now interest rates are going up. And so demand for homes are, but it's been going up. And so a lot of people in Santa Fe County have been saying, all right, we need to do something about this because we're being squeezed out. And there, it's not so much about the price, but it's about the taxes, which are based upon that, where people are being squeezed out of their housing because they can't afford property taxes. And so that's some sort of an example there. But it's a pretty good example because there's also an issue with a shortage of housing generally. By the way, there's a shortage of housing in a lot of places in the country right now. Albuquerque's got a shortage of housing. I mean, if you've been watching the news lately, the mayor's been talking about trying to create 30,000, was it 30 or 40,000 new single family units, probably mostly rental, but some owner occupied, because to deal with the housing shortage. And so there's a lot of cases of shortages. But this is a case in which this is not sort of naturally arising. This is where government steps in and says, look, what's naturally happening, left to its own devices, is that supply is relatively fixed in the short run and demand keeps rising, which forces the price up, 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 and up. And people who are on a fixed income or people whose wages can't catch up with this end up being squeezed out. And New York City was the classic example of this, where, you know, if you've ever been to Manhattan, Manhattan is not getting any bigger. It is what it is. And they can grow more housing, but they've got to kind of go up. But they can't go up everywhere in Manhattan because you can't build high everywhere in Manhattan. So as a result, rents have gone up and up and up and up. And so rent control in New York City and other places, San Francisco and Philadelphia, were put in place. And so the ceiling price is there, okay? Well, what this results in is this. This is not an equilibrium condition. The quantity demanded is here, the quantity supplied is here. All we're doing is simply saying, okay, well, how does this, nobody's outlawed the law of demand, nobody's outlawed the law of supply, and so you've got quantity supplied getting less than quantity demanded. Well, that is the condition of a shortage. So you end up with a housing shortage, simply because of the fact that you've got this kind of thing going on. Now, there are lots of different elements, and this is why we talk about rent-controlled housing, is because this is almost a perfect case study. It's almost like a scientist would do an experiment in a lab, except that we as economists don't have the opportunity to do this very much because we can't create conditions by which people live, but we can study conditions. And where you've got a shortage, and the shortage is measurable, it's the difference between this interval here, this intercept there, and this intercept there. That's the amount of housing units that are a shortage as a result. And why would this be the case? Why would we have issues with with rent control housing and why it would create a shortage. Well, first of all, and one of these, and I'll get to this a bit more in depth in a second, is sellers would love to have this price here, but they're stuck with this price there. So they're not keen on that, and they're going to make fewer units available. And if they're limited as the amount that they're going to earn, they're going to try to make fewer units available as opposed to more, because why would you? If you are in an area in which you can't create more housing, by the way, then maybe you take your shop and you move elsewhere. Maybe you decide not to be in Manhattan or San Francisco proper, which those are pretty small places. So you could walk across the width of Manhattan in a couple of hours, 3 hours, maybe. San Francisco, and same thing. These are not big places. Supply is not growing, but yet you've got demand going up and up and up. And so as a result, there's a shortage. And in fact, the classic example of housing shortages in New York City, which is pretty grotesque, is that historically people would get up early, get the newspaper, find out who died, find where they live, knock on doors with the landlord saying, hey, is this unit going to become available? Fortunately, I don't see a lot of that happening in this part of the country, but that has traditionally been one way to get your hands on a unit where there's a shortage, is to find out it was passed away. Again, that's pretty kind of a perverse outcome, but there are some other perverse outcomes as well. So let's talk about these outcomes and what some of the problems are, specifically with rent controlled housing, just because I think it's probably the classic example of a case in which it was good intentions. You don't want low-income people being squeezed out. You don't want them to have to move. If they're living in Manhattan, they've lived there for 40 years, you don't want them to have to move to New Jersey or to Long Island or wherever. You want them to stay, but there are some problems, and that is this. So number one, housing shortage. Okay, so we're saying some of the problems specifically here deal with rent ceilings. So a housing shortage, which is obviously something we've talked about here just a second ago, and that's the out of equilibrium condition. We're saying the market can't clear because the market can't get there. The government has got a mandated price below the equilibrium price, and nobody's outlawed the forces of demand and supply. As a result, to mandate that price means you've got a shortage going on. And by the way, the same thing would likely happen if we were to impose a price control on gasoline, and there would be a shortage. I can tell you exactly what will happen because I saw this back in the late 80s, early 90s, when price had been low for years and years and then started to spike up. And we saw gas stations just say, you know what, their margins were being squeezed too. They were trying to be competitive with the price of gasoline. And they were just closing early. They just weren't, in other words, weren't making as much available. Well, that's a shortage. If you can't get as much available, that's an example of shortage, simply because of the fact that the government was really putting pressure on suppliers to keep prices low. Okay, not an outright price control, but it's something similar. Okay, here's one thing. This is, again, these are things that are not unintended. So we talked about the unintended consequences, is that landlords tend not to maintain properties. This is a classic example. There was a study done in Scandinavia, which has had rent controls and all kinds of government controls in markets for a very long time. And some studies show that landlords tend not to maintain properties. And the reason why is this. What does this mean if there's a shortage? It means that the quantity demand exceeds the quantity supply. So that's an out of equilibrium condition. If you're a seller, I think you would probably favor that condition, because if somebody doesn't like what you're offering them, which by the way, you're constrained because of the price, if they don't like what you're offering, then they can get out of line and somebody else is there because the quantity demand is so much greater than the quantity supply. Take it or leave it. It's nothing that we have to talk about. And by the way, if there's nothing we have to talk about, there's a line of people, I will not maintain the property as well as what I should. And so one of the areas leading to the decline of particularly rental housing is the fact that landlords don't have to maintain it, because the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded. And as a result, the falling apart of some of these properties is there. And I even saw this when I was in graduate school. I had a professor who had a property that it was a rental unit and was subject to some rent control. And he just decided, I think the elevator broke, and he decided not to repair it. And I said, well, why are you doing that? He said, well, I don't want to pay for it because I'm not earning very much. And it's like, okay, well, whatever. In other words, landlords acting like landlords, right? Not maintaining properties. And so that's a problem. Also, here's another, this is probably not intentional at all, but the advantages to consumers only extend to those lucky enough to obtain rent controlled housing. Now, no doubt there are people who benefit from that below market price, but it's those who are lucky enough. And here we get into this concept, a term called economic luck, which is not some term I just invented, it is a real thing. And that is sometimes you just simply luck into something, right? You go to Las Vegas, you put a quarter in the slot machine, and it's the only quarter you plan on spending, and boom, you get paid $300, right? You didn't do anything, you didn't earn it, but you suddenly got paid off, right? So that's an example of luck. And economic luck extends. There's a tremendous amount of literature on this, academic literature, on this idea of economic luck, where people sometimes are just lucky to be born with the name Rockefeller or whatever. And as a result, they get advantages, economic advantages that others that don't extend to others. But it also extends to random events where you are lucky enough to get housing and others can't. So yes, you get the benefit, but the benefits are rationed, which is what an equilibrium condition does, is it rations the availability. It's a rationing mechanism that is imposed. So the advantage is really to those who are lucky enough to get it. And here's probably the most egregious outcomes, which again were unintentional, as possibilities for cheating. And we're talking about primarily on the supply side, but also on the demand side. So we've got a lot of culprits running around here. So possibilities for cheating. Let's talk about the supply side. Excessive rent deposits. Okay, what does this mean? Okay, well, the unit that you would like to get $2,000 for is you're only going to be able to charge $1,500. And so you tell this long line of people trying to get this unit in an area where there's a shortage of housing, okay, it's $1,500 per month. And the deposit up front is $5,000, or something that's really egregious, many times the amount of monthly rent. And that's the deposits. That's what you need to pay up front in order to get in. And so as a result, you get that. Or there's something that's known as key charges. And it's like, okay, it's $1,500 a month. And to get the keys are going to be $2,000. I mean, that sounds like an absurdity, and it really is. It's the same thing as excessive deposit. Okay. You have to pay a lot up front. And it's just a way to offset the loss of consumers, the loss of producer surplus that is being created. Because remember, a lower price means lower producer surplus. So how to get around that is cheating, and that's this way. This might not actually be illegal in some cases. And there may be areas in which traditionally rent-controlled housing has not really addressed the issue of upfront and excessive deposits. And so as a result, you get that. Another example are things like add-ons, these are all sort of part and parcel. These first two are, and that is, if you want your heat turned on, that's another $2,000. You want hot water. Oh, I didn't know you wanted hot water, right? You've heard of this example of what used to be called cold water flats. And that is, they didn't have hot water unless you paid extra for them. And so as a result, that's an add-on. If you want the hot water turned on, if you want many blinds, that's another $500. Well in excess of the cost of these things. You want all these kinds of things. You want a phone jack. All these are examples of ways to sort of boost producer surplus, which is already being taken in. And then another one, which is also pernicious, and it sort of relates back to this idea of rationing, is this. Remember, if we go back to the demand and supply curve here, where let's say $2,000 is the price of the unit for that particular size and location and whatnot. But somebody says, you know what, I'll give you $3,000, okay? It's worth it to me because I live right down the street. Let's say it's Manhattan and I am a surgeon at this hospital, and I would really not rather have a car, and so I would rather just pay you $3,000. And by the way, what if a person were to give you $2,000? I'll write you a check every month, and $1,000 were to magically appear in cash under your door. Would a person be able to do that, right? You see what I'm getting at, right? It's sort of an underground illegal transaction where somebody's saying, I'll pay you more than what you're even charging at the market price because I really, really, really want this unit. So that's clearly illegal. That's an underground rent because it even exceeds the market price. But keep in mind, nobody's outlawed the law of demand. There are some people, it's a small quantity back toward the origin there, but a small quantity would pay an even greater price. We know there are people willing to pay a greater than asking price because we see this happening whenever single family housing is rising in demand, when people pay more than the asking price because they really, really want the unit. And we see this happening when people are willing to pay more and give up some of their consumer surplus because they have to have that particular thing. But it ends up squeezing out the people that are trying to. This is not to protect highly paid surgeons. This is to protect people on a fixed income, low to moderate income people who we can otherwise squeeze. It was not intended to protect highly paid, heart surgeons or whatever. So again, that's a perverse effect that is part of this that kind of comes out of it. So I'm trying to see what the clock is, how much time I've got. So, okay, so that's on the supply side. What about the demand side? Well, the demand side, how about subletting at higher than mandated rents? That is, okay, I was lucky enough to get this unit at $1,500 per month. Here, and oh, you know what? My camera, I don't know if I did that or what. Here, let me move the camera back. I don't really want to live here, but I will sublet it. And in fact, I'll do this for multiple units as much as I can. I'll rent these units because I've got good credit, I've got a good income. Everybody knows I'm good for it. But I'll go in and I'll sublet it at higher than mandated rents, and so I'll charge $1,800, $1,900, whatever, and I'll pocket the difference. I'll make sure the rent's paid every month because I'm subletting it. This is also not the intention. It's not to protect people who are acting as investors, people coming in who've got nothing to do. It's a third party. We've got nothing to do with tenant-landlord relationships. They just kind of slide in and sublet to maybe people with less than good credit, maybe less than the right amount of income. In other words, they're taking away people's consumer surplus. We see this happening a lot where there are lots of actors in the economy who will take advantage of lower income, what we call low to moderate income consumers, and that is by charging them excessive rates for whatever it is they do. Lots and lots of examples everywhere throughout the economy. Unfortunately, with price controls, this does tend to happen. And again, I think that when these first were imposed, they were imposed for good reasons. They were trying to make sure that people didn't get squeezed out of housing, particularly in units that they've been in for a very long time. So as a result, controls were put in. And frankly, there are lots of benefits to people who have the economic luck to lock in a price. And you know, I read a story a few years ago of because I think they still film soap operas in New York City. I think I don't know why I know that because I'm here, not at home to watch soap operas, but they still film them there. And there was an actor who just died, and she had locked into some sort of rent control back in like the early 70s or something. She'd been around, or maybe it was a he. It doesn't matter. An actor who'd locked in for a very long time. A very, very highly paid person who was paying a very inexpensive amount, like $500 or something, which Albuquerque, or much less in Manhattan, would be very affordable to a highly paid person, much less somebody who was lesser income. But that was an example of these sorts of market distortions. When she died, the landlord was quite happy, which again, we don't want people being happy with someone else's demise, but that seems to be one of those outcomes. And one thing about this, and I know I've had lots of students over a lot of years who have talked about this idea of rent control, and it differs. These are some sort of generic effects. They're certainly not in every single case of every rent control situation over time, because they differ. But these are some of the ones that are the most obvious and egregious ones, which, by the way, are not intended to be the consequences of these protective acts. They're intended to really sort of protect the demand side of the market from some of the potential abuses of the supply side, but it ends up not always working out. So as a result, that's an example of the difficulties with price ceilings. Okay, so are there questions for me about price ceilings? That is, prices set below equilibrium price. Okay, well, I've got about 9 minutes, I guess, since I think we have enough time here, and that's to talk about the other type of major price issue or price control. That's price floors. Okay, price floors, again, don't think of them being down low, think of them being up high, and that is the idea that the government will mandate a price above the equilibrium price. Why will they do that? I mean, you know, because it seems like the opposite motivation, doesn't it? In fact, it's a different set of actors who are being quote unquote protected, right? Because in what you can sort of understand and sympathize with the idea of trying to keep prices low for low to moderate income folks, ordinary consumers, ordinary individuals. Why would you want to prop up the price to sellers who maybe don't quote unquote deserve it, right? And again, the term deserve, all this has to do with normative judgment system, who should have something and who should not have something. And so agricultural output is really the classic example of a price floor. In fact, I'm sort of hard pressed to think of too many other market examples, but that do not match the example of price floor. But the outcome that we talked about was the idea of surpluses will result. Again, in out of equilibrium condition. We already sort of talked about that. That's the most obvious one. But also, here's another bit of perniciousness, and that is the idea that surpluses themselves. Keep in mind, we're reverse the condition here. And by the way, let me, I do an example. Let me see, I do an example of a ceiling, or price ceiling, but I did do have a price floor. So let me just put this briefly up here, and I'll swivel the camera over here. Then we'll talk about some of the effects of these. So, whoa, what did I just do here? Hold on a second. I know nobody in this room knows. I just zoomed a crazy way here. Okay, hold on. Hold on. Oh shoot. And there is a real, and if you're, the camera's all over the place, and it's because the fact there's a real lag time going on here. I hit one of these buttons and it takes a while to show up. So okay, let me zoom out, zoom out, zoom out. Okay. And I apologize, this is a little bit of a clunky way to handle this, but it is kind of what we've got, and it works a little bit better when we have the handheld, but I don't know what happened to that. It kind of walked away. Whoever took it, it's probably going to be disappointed. I really don't think it's going to work on their TV at home. So anyway, who knows? Who knows? Okay, well, we've talked about the example of price ceiling, what that looks like. What about a price floor? What does that look like? Okay, so let's go back to this PQ plane, but now we're dealing with the opposite condition of a price floor. So you've got a PQ plane, you've got a demand curve that's downward sloping like that. You've got an upward sloping supply curve looking something like that. And you've got an equilibrium price of whatever. Let's say it's agricultural output, and let's say the market price, the market determined price is $35 for say a bushel of corn, for instance. Let's just take corn as an example. You've got a mandated price that's up here, and the government mandates a price of 50. Okay. So the price is set above the equilibrium price. And so what do we have here? We have quantity supplied being out here, quantity demanded being out here. So as a result, we've got a surplus. The amount of the surplus is the difference between these 2 points on the quantity axis. It's that interval, whatever that value happens to be, is the amount of the surplus. In other words, and sometimes they're called price supports. Price supports, which sounds a little bit more like more, I guess, supportive, I guess, to sort of put it nicely. That's the idea of propping up the price. Now, why would the government want to do this? Well, it could be that agricultural producers sometimes say, look, we can't make money at these particular prices, and so we need help. We need the government to prop up the price. Of whatever the good in question is, dairy products have been propped up in price over the years. And again, not all are in effect now, and some have come and gone, some have been for a limited time, have expired. Grains have been propped up over time, and I know this from my own family's experience with the benefit of a propped up price, and as a result, because sellers, that is farmers, and everybody connected with the supply chain, sellers and agricultural cooperatives and agribusiness companies, increasingly agriculture is a corporation, is a corporate enterprise, not so much a family enterprise. Everybody wants a higher price. If you're a seller, though, don't you want a higher price? So as a result, sellers wanting higher prices is sort of basic economics from our standpoint. So what about some of these problems with price controls? Well, first is the surplus, which I just talked about there. And the second is that surpluses sometimes are purchased outright by the government or are simply destroyed, which is maybe even more pernicious. But sometimes these are purchased outright by government. And I know part of the country where I come from is very agricultural. There's lots of dairy and lots of lots of cattle. Generally, some are dairy, some are beef. But I know that we had something that used to be called sort of colloquially as welfare cheese. This term may be familiar. You didn't have to be on welfare. It was the government buying excess dairy products and making cheese. They would just give it away. You didn't have to be on any kind of welfare program. You just had to go show up, and they would give you a big block of cheese. It was about the size of a toaster, and it would last for a long time. Usually, it would get stale before you used it. But it was free. The government was just giving it away because they intend to purchase the surplus. Well, that's intended. I mean, that really affects the market in that way, because you can just keep on producing, underproduce, knowing that they've got a market to sell to, because the surplus has got to go somewhere. That market's not clearing here. And so as a result, government will oftentimes buy the surplus. Another example that I have heard of before, and I haven't seen this personally, but where there's excess dairy production, is the government will buy the surplus and just destroy those, pour it down the drain. And that's even worse, because people have said, why don't you send that to parts of the world where people need that and are starving. And then we get into sort of economics and the politics of food, because then if you do that, you end up shifting the supply curve to the right, and it brings the price back down on the global market, which is what the intent was, to put it up, not down. And believe me, there's been lots and lots and lots of discussion about the economics and politics of food production. And all we're doing is just simply talking about this. But I do want to point out that there are these other effects that happen as a result of these market distortions. So too much production is dedicated output that's not needed. Farmers and other producers will produce output that simply the demand side does not match up with the supply side. And so as a result, that's difficult. There's one other area about that makes agricultural economics complicated, and that is this idea of not really being able to know how much exactly you're going to be able to produce because weather conditions, too much rain, too little rain, too hot, too cold. All these are factors we really don't know. This is why crop insurance has been around forever. This is why one of the oldest markets of what we call the futures market has been around, so that people can lock in prices well in advance of that good being delivered, just so they have some assurance, because there's so much variability. It is a difficult way of life, and those economies in the world that rely only on agriculture are really at the mercy of all of these forces. Okay, and then finally, it tends to be heavily subject to political intervention, and that is simply, if you consider the fact, I talked about the case of Japan, but the US has also got its own issues here, and that is farm states have the same number of senators as do big manufacturing states. Montana has the same number of senators that California has. South Dakota, the same number of people in the US Senate as do big manufacturing states like New Jersey and New York. So as a result, there's an outsized amount of political power. You see this happening, particularly in these areas where there isn't much, that's the big activity, whether it's Iowa, or South Dakota, or Montana, or Idaho, where they've got lots and lots of political power, simply because of the fact that they've got an outsized amount of representation. Just given the way, and I'm just talking about the US here, the way our system is organized. Okay. All right. So questions for me. It's 2:44. So I finished with about a minute to spare. So this leads us, and you can see where I'm going here. We're going to pick up chapter 5. This is a great place to stop. We're going to pick up chapter 5 on Wednesday. And chapter 5 is going to deal with this topic of elasticity, which is really sort of getting us into the heart of this course. So the questions for me from anybody, either in the room or on Zoom.
I mean, none of these formulas actually would exist if it was like a monopolies in our economy.
Well, if there was a monopoly, then we'd have a whole set of different reactions on the part of government. And what the government would tend to do is try to encourage more supply. If the supply curve shifts right, the price should theoretically come down. So yeah, in the case of monopoly, like we only had one producer of whatever, then that's part of the goal of anti-monopoly regulations, to bring in more producers that now compete with one another, so that we have price competition, which is considered to be good for the demand side.
So all of those formulas would go out the window if we would live in a monopoly.
Well, I don't, yeah, maybe, but I don't, yeah, but that's sort of highly speculative, highly theoretical. I can't see a case in which there's one monopoly across the economy, and because of the fact that monopolies tend to be sort of a disappearing phenomenon, really they are, because we're a global economy, and even among the very biggest of firms, with the exception of local monopolies, we like P&M, and we'll talk about why those are exceptions. It's because nobody would want to compete against UNM or UNM, CNN. What? UNM, CNN, P&M. Okay, I got the right initials there. So nobody would want to compete against PNM, right? And so as a result, that's it. But we're starting to see monopolies sort of go away on a global basis, and we really are. And which is why I find it interesting that we're getting this Google discussion, because we really haven't had a big antitrust action in this country since the Microsoft trial. That's been 25 years ago. So yeah, so let's look at the monopolies a bit later. It's an interesting discussion, and we'll see how the market is even more distorted by monopolies, even than these price controls, which are also sort of fading away over time. So, okay. All right. Well, everybody have a great day. See you on Wednesday.
Okay.